Now, before we get to Homer, I just want to reiterate one more time the memory-based model, the memory-based model basically in a sentence. And you're going to hear me repeat the sentence over and over again, and I'm hoping that that'll be a clue to you that I'm expecting to see something like this sentence in your essays if you get a question about the memory-based model, right? So according to the memory-based model, when people answer survey questions, they do not do an exhaustive search of everything they have stored in memory. They do not analyze all of the different attitudes that they have about whatever question they've been asked. They take a random sample of attitudes, mostly from the top of the head, and not so much from the back of the head. And they take the sample mostly from the top of the head because that's the information that is most accessible. Information in the back of the head, as I explained in my Tale of Benjamin Lee, is harder to access. And so we basically take a shortcut when we answer survey questions by taking a random sample, mostly of the information that's easily available and easily accessible in our head. And so with that, let's take a look at Homer Simpson, and we're going to imagine Homer Simpson being asked, going home and his phone rings, and there's a survey, people doing a survey, and they're going to ask him whether or not he approves or disapproves of the job the president is doing. In this first visual representation of the memory-based information processing model, you can see I have this X-ray of Homer Simpson's head. And let me describe what you're looking at so I can explain how the memory-based process works. The thing to keep in mind, once again, and you're going to hear me repeat the sentence over and over again, according to the memory-based model, when people express opinions, they do so after taking a random sample of attitudes, mostly from the top of the head, not so much from the back of the head, and based on that sample, they express an opinion. So here I have Homer Simpson, and he's got attitudes, and these attitudes in his head are about the president. And so what we're going to assume here is the plus signs denote a positive feeling about the president, and the minus signs denote something negative about the president. And on the picture, you can see that in Homer's head, at the top of his head, because remember, it's an important distinction between the top of the head and the back of the head. At the top of the head, Homer has 3 positive attitudes about the president and 2 negative attitudes about the president, right? And so the way this works is that a positive attitude is going to make him say he approves the president of what the job the president's doing. A negative attitude is going to make him say he disapproves of the job the president is doing. So at the top of his head, he's got 3 positive attitudes, 2 negative attitudes. In the back of his head, there are more attitudes, and in this case, he's got 14 positive attitudes and only 4 negative attitudes. So overall, in both the top of his head and the back of his head, there's 17 positive attitudes and 6 negative attitudes. So that's the layout that we have here. So how does the memory-based model work? If Homer gets a phone call and he's asked, do you approve or disapprove of the job the president is doing, he's going to take a random sample of attitudes. Now the circles around each of the attitudes in the top of his head and the back of his head denote the random sample that Homer took. And the way you can think about this random sample is, imagine if you had a bowl of marbles, some that have pluses on them, some that have minuses on them, and they were stirred up in random order and you reached in and grabbed some. This is the basic idea behind the random sampling process. So in this particular case, when Homer did his random sample, he sampled 3 positive things about the president and 1 negative thing. Then in the back of his head, he sampled 1 positive thing and 1 negative thing. So altogether, in terms of the sample that he did, when he took a random sample of attitudes, his random sample yielded 4 positive things and 1 negative thing. And so as a result, when he was asked, do you approve or disapprove the job the president is doing, because he's got way more positives than negatives in his sample, he's going to say, I approve. So that's the basic idea behind the memory-based model. That what Homer isn't going to do is he's not going to process all of the information about the president that he has stored in memory, because he just doesn't have time for that. Instead, he's just going to take a random sample, mostly from the top of the head, not so much from the back of the head, and based on that sample, he's going to express an opinion. Now, here's the important thing about the memory-based model. Let's go back to Homer's original state with his 3 positives at the top of his head and his 2 negatives and so on. So the key here is that the memory-based model is what we call a probabilistic model, meaning it's based on probabilities. And so this is also something that could happen based on the memory-based model. Again, Homer is asked, do you approve or disapprove of the job the president is doing? Now keep in mind that the attitudes that he has at the top of his head and the back of the head are identical to the ones that he had before. But since he's doing a random sample, in this case what happens is he samples 3 attitudes from the top of his head. This time only 1 of them is positive and 2 of them are negative. And then in the back of his head, he samples 2 negative attitudes, right? Well, that means that in his total sample, he's only got 1 positive thing, 1 positive attitude in his sample of attitudes. He's got 4 negative ones. And so in this case, even though what was in his head was identical to the question that was asked the first time, now when he's asked, do you approve or disapprove of the job the president is doing? In this case, Homer says, I disapprove. So the memory-based model allows for people to go back and forth between answers, positive and negative, approve and disapprove, not because they're idiots, not because they don't know what's going on, but because when you understand the process by which people answer survey questions, this process by which they take random samples of attitudes, mostly from the top of the head, not so much from the back of the head, it explains why they might get these kind of, you might get different responses based on the memory-based model, and not because people are just dumb. This is a key to understanding the memory-based model. So by way of summary, again, according to the memory-based model, an individual's opinion is based on the attitudes that they sample. In the question that was asked of Homer Simpson, do you approve or disapprove of the job the president is doing? If most of the attitudes that he sampled were positive, he would say, I approve. If most of the attitudes that he sampled were negative, he would say, I disapprove. It's all based on the composition of the attitudes stored at the top of the head and the back of the head, but again, mostly at the top of the head. So what does that mean? What that means is that our opinions are very much shaped by the information or the attitudes that we have stored in memory. And understanding what's stored in memory and why it's stored in memory is critically important to understanding how people answer survey questions. It's also critically important in understanding what kind of people's opinions are likely to change from survey to survey, and what kind of people are unlikely to change. And then on top of that, that'll also help explain the influence of the media. And by that I mean who the media can influence and who the media can't influence. But we'll start off in the next video talking about something called the RAS model.